good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am the Canterbury Catholic, and today I'm going to be I'm going to be reacting to a video. It's a video titled Five Bad Arguments for Catholicism, parentheses, as commonly presented in YouTube comments. It's from a channel known as Gospel Simplicity, which is a channel run by a young gentleman named Austin. I believe his last name is Suggs. Hopefully, I'm pronouncing that correctly. Austin Suggs. And he's a Protestant Christian who has spent, I want to say like maybe the past 3 years on YouTube, just doing videos concerning anything and everything Christian related. I've actually been a follower of Gospel Simplicity in Austin since the early days, and I've kind of watched, and he's certainly grown and done a phenomenal job kind of documenting some of his thoughts, doing interviews, exploring a lot of that's my cat, exploring the wide arrays of Christianity. And it's very interesting. It's very wholesome content and very, very well done. Austin just graduated from Moody Bible Institute, which is a Protestant college, and recently was married. And he spent a lot of time exploring Catholicism on his channel. And while I don't think I would say he's anywhere near a conversion, he's been very fair and very charitable to Catholicism, and certainly given it, at least it seems to me, a fair shakedown. Talking to priests, talking to apologists, touring churches and monasteries, and so on and so forth, and being very receptive to Protestant Catholic dialogue. And so when I saw that he uploaded this video, I knew for sure I wanted to watch it, but I figured, why not? I might as well record my reaction and give my thoughts, because I think I'd have some things to say on the matter as well. So, without further ado, let's check out 5 bad arguments for Catholicism as commonly presented in the YouTube comments.
But with all that being said, let's jump into it. The first bad argument for Catholicism goes something like this: John 6, therefore Catholic. Or maybe slightly more detailed. John 6 is speaking literally about Jesus being present in the Eucharist, therefore you need to be Catholic. Now, why do I see this as a bad argument? Is it because I think John 6 doesn't point to a view of Christ being truly present in the Eucharist? Actually, no, that's not it. I've made a video on that, and you can check that out if you'd like. Is it because I think the Catholic view of the Eucharist is bad? Well, not necessarily that either. The reason I think this is a bad argument is that it attempts to make too big of a jump and overlooks all the incremental steps you would have to take to get to that final point of the argument. In other words, it's missing steps in its premises to conclusion.
Yeah, so some initial thoughts on that. I agree. I like the way he posed, he kind of characterized this argument, right? John 6, therefore, or just Bible verse, therefore. That's, we have a word for that. It's called, biblical fundamentalism, and it is largely frowned upon within Catholicism, Orthodoxy, and even amongst Protestants. I think this can be summed up really in just being like, hey, if you're going to criticize, like the Baptists for the same thing, or the Presbyterians, just being overly literal and not contextualizing anything, and drawing a hard and fast conclusion, again, without any context or without making nuances and distinctions, which is what Christianity has always been about, and what is still maintained largely in Catholicism and Orthodoxy, then we ought not to be presenting that as some sort of substantial argument. And he also, and piggybacking off of that, he talks about making too big of a leap. Yes, it is true that if the Eucharist is true, and the Eucharist subsists substantially and truly within churches with apostolic succession, namely, to paint with a broad brush, namely Catholicism and Orthodoxy, that then, would I make the argument that therefore you have to be part, the argument has to be explored that I need to be part of one of those churches. Yes, but I'm saying that from an insider. From an outsider, that can be, we need to understand that might be a really big jump, right? Because then now we have to explore the question of, okay, well, the Eucharist, I'm told, is present in Catholicism and Orthodoxy, but the Anglicans will say they have the Eucharist as well, and some Lutherans will as well. But then there's the old Catholics, and then the SSPX, and these schismatic churches that are in these independent so you have to take it step by step, and that's a very good point that he made.
Just because John 6 could be speaking literally about Christ being present in the Eucharist doesn't mean that you need to become Catholic. Now, it could be positive evidence towards Catholicism because that is part of Catholic claims that Christ is truly present in the Eucharist. But you could also believe that Christ is present in the Eucharist, that John 6 is speaking about that, and not be Catholic. In fact, there are many Christians who do just that. And they're not doing that just in spite of a deep need to become Catholic, but just denying it. But actually because that's what their denominations, that's what their church traditions believe.
Right. It's a lot more nuanced, right? If you ascribe to the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, that doesn't automatically point to Catholicism, because like I said, there are plenty of denominations, other churches, break-off groups that claim to have the Eucharist, right? And so that isn't valid to say that, if, John 6, therefore Catholicism. Technically speaking, we have to assume that this person who comes to accept the real presence of the Eucharist doesn't have a full understanding of apostolic succession, of, how schism works and historical break-offs, and how, understanding the concept of the magisterium. It's a lot more deep than that, so.
For instance, you could believe that John 6 is speaking literally about Christ being present in the Eucharist and be Orthodox. Mm-hmm. Or you could be Lutheran. Or you could be Reformed. Or Anglican. Or any number of Christian traditions. Mm-hmm. Therefore, to move straight from John 6 to therefore you need to be Catholic simply overlooks way too much, makes too big of a claim, and ultimately, therefore, is not a helpful argument.
Yes, the Eucharist is the source and summit of our faith, as is stated in the Catechism, but we can't, we have to remember that, again, as an outsider looking in, Christianity is very broad, and just because you accept the Eucharist does not mean that things like the intercession of the saints or the magisterium or apostolic succession as a whole is ipso facto true. The stepwise motion here.
So, for that reason, I think this argument should either be retired or at the very least nuanced. To say, you know what, John 6 points towards a Catholic view of the Eucharist. It's one that's shared by others, but if you believe it's literal, well, that is a step along the way to maybe accepting some other Catholic claims. If you want to make that argument, I think that's a fine argument, but let's make sure to not lose nuance in making the first argument.
And listen, it can be very much the case that someone comes to accept the Eucharist and then go straight to Catholicism. I believe Swan Sona had an experience like that, or when he was seriously investigating Catholicism, he said something to the effect of like, the Eucharist was not a stumbling block for me, because I figured that if that's actually Jesus, then I think his actual words were, if that's actually Jesus, then I want to eat him. In other words, I want to be as close to him as physically as possible. So that's not to say that, John 6, therefore Catholicism is not something that never happens, but we can't use that as a template, or as a strong case for everyone. Right? It's going to be very nuanced and very situational, depending on the person, their past experience, and their general disposition in their faith.
The second argument that I think is a bad argument for Catholicism is an argument that I see all the time on YouTube, and it goes something like this. Who founded your church? You see, Luther founded your church, or Calvin founded your church, or Joe Schmo down the street 2 years ago founded your church, but Jesus founded the Catholic Church, and therefore you should be.
Now, okay, before I hear what he has to say, I actually find this to be, like, in my head, my cradle Catholic brain, born Catholic, have always been Catholic, probably, well, I will die Catholic. In my head, that is actually, like, I wouldn't say that's my primary argument for Catholicism, but that is one that I have in my head constantly. When I'm talking to, when I get a letter in the mail from Edna 2 neighborhoods over, who wrote me a handwritten letter saying I need to go to her Kingdom Hall and become a JW, and I write her a letter back saying, I'll say something to the effect of, trace the lineage of your church. Tell me what year and who founded it. And that's usually one that I use, so I'm interested to see what he has to say.
Catholic. Now, what do I see as the problem with this? I think this argument fails on the level of misunderstanding Protestant claims, specifically Protestant ecclesiology, meaning Protestant view of what the church is. You see, when a Protestant looks at Calvin as the founder of the Reformed Church, they're not saying that Calvin founded the entire church, right? That Calvin started a new Christianity. Now, maybe you feel that way, but the Protestant doesn't. So to use that Calvin founded your church and Jesus founded my church is a false dichotomy to a Protestant. Because for many Protestants, they will have a view of the visible and invisible church. That Calvin may have started a new expression or tried to reform the existing church, but he wasn't creating a new church. He was still part of the one holy Catholic and apostolic church, and ultimately that church is founded by Jesus. Now, again, you can take issue with this, but have the argument at that level, not at the simple kind of pop, trying to be catchy like Jesus versus Calvin, because that's not how any Protestant would actually think. Therefore, it's not going to be a convincing argument.
Okay, fair enough. I get the sense that what he's trying to say is, and maybe he'll make this point later, but it seems to me he's saying that Protestants don't view Martin Luther the same way Mormons view what's the guy's name? John Smith? It's not John Smith. Anyways, the founder of Mormonism. John Smith? I don't know. But in other words, they don't view him as a prophet, we could say. And you know what? Fair enough. I think as a Catholic, like I said, it can be hard for me sometimes to remember that. I will say, however, he mentioned Protestant ecclesiology, and he's talking like he's saying a Protestant as if it's cookie cutter. I don't think it's I don't want to say fair, but I don't think it's necessarily accurate to say Protestant ecclesiology, because I think it's more accurate to say Protestant ecclesiologies, right? Protestant is such a blanket term that no two Protestants are the same. And I feel like that's a nature of Protestantism. I would call it, I view that as a criticism. Some Protestants actually view that as a compliment and something that is good about Protestantism. So maybe that's why it's hard for Catholics to understand that, is because we kind of do the same thing, in that we view Protestants in one way, when in reality they're so diverse, and their understandings of these Reformation, these Protestant Revolution leaders, Calvin, Zwingli, Luther, to name a few, it's not the same person by person. So just some thoughts on that.
Now, this does make another mistake in assuming that Jesus founded the Catholic Church. Now, I'm not saying that's wrong, but what I'm saying is that it smuggles that in as an unproven assertion, right? That's not a conclusion you've come to based on premises you've given or based on arguments that you've supplied, but you're simply saying that Jesus founded the Catholic Church.
Okay, I get what he's saying there. Yeah, so he's saying don't refute a Protestant's assertion by making your own assertion and not being prepared to back it up, right? Or assuming that by making your making your counter assertion, the Protestant's going to automatically accept it, right? I agree with that.
And that someone else founded this, but maybe they don't agree with you. And the argument's going
Right.
to fail before it starts if you try to smuggle in claims that others are going to see as contentious. So for those reasons, I think this argument should either be retired or, you'll see a trend here, nuanced. The third argument I think is ultimately a bad argument for Catholicism is one that I hear a whole lot. And that is, who gave you the authority to judge the Catholic
Oh,
Church?
yeah, no, that's awful. That is terrible. Who gave you the authority? That's just poorly phrased. I wonder if when people say that, or if when he's come across that argument, what the person meant to say. Well, I'm presuming the person who's presenting this argument is a Catholic. I wonder if what they mean is, who gave you the authority to... How can I even say this without coming across the... Almost like, who gave you the authority to create your own judgments on matters of faith and morals? Is what I would assume, Sally Catholic or John Catholic, when he presents this argument, that's probably what he means. In other words, like, the Catholic argument that when we discuss it, we tend to view it, we'll call it the everyone's their own pope type thing. So I assume that's what they mean. But if people are actually out there saying, who gave you the authority to judge the Catholic Church, that is just awful, and that is very pompous and very what's the word? Just very I mean, I would fight back and say, well, who gave you the authority to to question my church? Because if I viewed your church as some ultimate authority, then I would probably be part of your church. So it does not then follow that then you can just judge my church if I'm a Protestant. So that is awful. That was very poorly phrased.
And this can be an impactful argument because I think there's a good instinct in Christians to want to promote the virtue of humility. And so when they hear someone saying, who gave you this authority? How arrogant of you?
Yeah.
They can cower and think, oh man, am I doing something wrong? But here's why I think this argument is ultimately not a good argument. I think it fails to recognize that there's always going to be some level of personal judgment involved in the act of submission. And second, that submission isn't just an unqualified good. Let's break those down. For the first layer, you're saying, who are you to judge the Catholic Church? Rather, you should just submit to it.
Yeah.
Okay. But if I'm going to submit to it, there's going to be a process of reasoning, or at least a choice that I am making based on my personal judgment to submit to that thing or to not submit to it. So even in doing that, there is some level of personal judgment of judging that this is a valid authority that I should therefore submit to. And that gets into the second point, that submitting to authority isn't just this unqualified good. Submitting to authority is only a good thing when there's a valid authority claim being made.
Yeah, so, as Catholics, we subscribe to the submit to the magisterium, but we can't just say you need to submit to the magisterium and not give reason why, because to someone outside the church hearing that's going to seem rather cultish, I would imagine, and also if frankly just a completely baseless claim. It would be like going to going to a third world country, going to Russia, going to not that Russia is a third world country, but going to somewhere so different than the United States, let's say, and mandating that those people divorce themselves of their cultures and their social predispositions and adopt American cultures, culturalisms and so on and so forth. Like it just doesn't work that way. And he makes a good point that obeisance and submission is only a virtue when it is in submission to something good, right? And so to a Protestant, being kind of having someone wag their finger at them and say you need to submit, but without this Protestant being 100% sure that the magisterium is good, just to say it that way, or is something instituted by Christ, like that we can't expect that as Catholics to, one, be effective, or two, carry any weight in the mind of a Protestant Christian or a non-Catholic, let's say, a non-Christian even. So that's a very good point.
all types of people are making authority claims all the time.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, do you think that it's an unqualified good as a Catholic to submit to Pope Michael? Or do you think it's an unqualified good to submit to, say, Islam? They're making authority claims.
Right,
Pope
yes.
Michael is making
Very
authority claims.
good.
There's authority
Right.
claims that abound everywhere. Simply because someone makes an authority claim doesn't mean that it's arrogant to not submit to it.
Correct. If the Supreme Court were to reinstate abortion, and in fact, if the federal government were to say the third child of every family must be aborted, we would not submit to that. In fact, we would actively defy it. We would openly defy it. You know, if anything, people might have kids in specifically to defy that law. You know, now maybe that's a bit extreme, but it's, you know, I think the sentiment is still there. You know, we can't expect them to submit to something they're not 100% sure on, or even 90% sure on, you know?
We don't.
I wouldn't submit to something if I had someone in front of me telling me what to do and I was only 30% sure that they were a decent person or they knew what they were talking about. I wouldn't submit to them, or even, you know, 90%.
Only be arrogant to not to submit to the authority if it was an authority that had some God-given authority, some validity to it. And so therefore to simply say that you must submit, while that person might not agree with that authority, or the question of that authority's validity is still up for debate, is ultimately not a helpful argument. Now, I've heard nuances of this argument that have gotten to substantial conversations.
Yeah.
You could talk about the witness of the church over the years. You could talk about kind of their group judgment and say, do you want to stand outside of that? Which is something like arguing along from expert authority, which could be a logical fallacy, but doesn't necessarily have to be. You could say that all of these, say, doctors believe this thing. Are you going to go against them? Now, they could be wrong, but going against them would put you in this place of seeming to have a greater maybe burden of evidence. So you could make the argument that way if you wanted, but simply asking who are you to judge the authority of the Catholic Church, you just need to submit or you're arrogant? Well, not only is that a bad argument, but I think it can be uncharitable and very unhelpful to dialogue between Catholics and Protestants.
And in the argument being presented as an accusation of arrogance on the part of the Protestant, it's really arrogant on the part of the Catholic to present it that way, right? To be like, to put this person down who I would say wouldn't know any better, you know, or has not been given the proper witness for them to maybe see, like, oh, there might be something to this Catholicism thing. So that was very well said on his part.
Or Catholics and any number of people. So for that reason, I think it should be either retired or substantially nuanced. The fourth argument that I think is a bad argument for the Catholic Church is one that might ruffle some feathers.
Oh boy.
And that's okay. I'm not out to do that, but if it does, I understand it. I'm happy to talk about it a bit in good faith. And so this is the argument that just makes blanket claims to all the church fathers agreed. All the church fathers said. The unanimous consensus of the fathers without necessarily giving any limitations to what you mean by that. And the reason this is a bad argument is because it makes too big of a claim that's too easily undermined.
I gotta say, before he starts with his breakdown of why it's a bad argument, I think the unanimous consensus of the fathers is not as big as of evidence for the truth of the Catholic claim as some people might think. And what's interesting is I don't notice a lot of like church ladies with, you know, church grandmas with their veils and their rosaries making this argument. I actually hear that a lot from, you know, evangelists and theologians, or apologists rather, I should say. And I've never thought it to be that great. I felt like it was too easy to tear down, right? Or it's too easy to refute. Now, I hold to the unanimous consensus of the fathers, but I've actually always viewed that to be not as substantial and theologically solid when arguing in favor of Catholicism. So my feathers are not ruffled.
Now, you could say that when I'm talking about the unanimous consensus of the fathers, I'm talking about on balance more than not. I'm talking about 70%. I'm talking about 80%. I'm talking about to not have this would be an outlier. Okay, those are better arguments, right? Because you're placing some limitations on what you're saying. But when people just constantly say, and I see it in the comment sections all the times of videos, all the church fathers said this or that. Well, it's just so easy to go find one church father who might disagree.
Right. Aquinas. I mean, the one that comes to mind immediately is Aquinas, right? Aquinas with the Immaculate Conception, right? And he's like the homeboy. He's the Roman homeboy, you know. So and that's exactly why I never felt like that was the best argument in favor of something. Excuse me. And most certainly not kind of an opening the door to Catholicism. Like, no one should throw that argument out with their first pitch of the faith. Like, that's just absurd.
Now, there is a bigger conversation to be had also about maybe some circularity there. If we only define church fathers by people who agree with something, and then to agree with that is to say all the church fathers, it can get a little slippery, but that's a conversation for another time.
Right. So, like, was Origen a church father after he was viewed as a heretic, declared? I don't know if he was ever officially declared a heretic. I would assume he is, or he was. But you know, did he lose his church fatherhood when that happened? You know, I think that's a good argument. Yeah.
I mean, not necessarily one I want to wade into right now. But my encouragement on this would be, if you want to make appeals to the majority of church fathers or to some consensus among church fathers, do so with some care and nuance. Because to say every church father believed in, say, infant baptism is just a recipe for someone being able to find one who seems to have
all it takes is just one
opinion.
That's all.
And
it
now
takes.
You might say one church father, that's not that much. And it wouldn't be that much if you didn't go making a claim that all agreed. Because suddenly that has been a little pin in that big balloon that was blown up and pushes all of the air out.
And that's all you need, right, to lose credibility, right? Especially when it comes to a Protestant, right? If we as Catholics or as Orthodox, you know, any apostolic Christian, or well, I should say a Christian in an apostolic church, if we're going to put so much weight on the church fathers and the church theologians and this concept of infused knowledge and the magisterium and this, that, and the other, when you're talking to, you know, an Auntie May from Georgia who's been going to First Baptist Bible Chapel her whole life, and you're trying to get her to look past her theological comfort zone and understand the historical context of the wider church, you can't be throwing out names of guys who were not infallible. I mean, barring the popes in very certain circumstances, but who, you know, just ultimately just guys who, men and women who lived in a certain time with a certain connection to the church. That's just not going to work, because all it takes is for Auntie May to just poke one little hole in that, and you lose all credibility, and then you lose a soul potentially.
The argument. So this is really just a lesson in choosing our words carefully, using nuance, and maybe not making bigger claims than we can substantiate.
Correct.
And the final. No video on bad arguments for Catholicism would be complete without touching on
Matthew
the
16.
most overplayed quote in all of Catholic
So Matthew
Protestant
16.
dialogue. It is by someone who I think was actually quite bright, someone who was interesting, someone who I wonder what he would think of his quote being used.
Is it John Henry Newman? To be steeped in history is to cease to be Protestant? Is it St. John Henry Newman?
Ad nauseum in the way that it's used. And that is none other than Cardinal John.
Called it.
In church history is to cease to be
Protestant.
Now,
okay, before he starts, the sentiment behind Cardinal Newman, and I've actually had a few people ask me why I have Cardinal Newman on like this like page in most of my videos. That's actually St. John Fisher. That's not Cardinal Newman. That's St. John Fisher, for clarification. But before he goes on, the sentiment behind what Cardinal Newman was saying, now St. John Henry Newman, is 100% true. Again, now, does it sound kind of backwards me saying that, because yes, because again, cradle Catholic. But talking to my Protestant friends who have then become Catholic, they all universally, they're all like, yeah, that's 100% true. Whether they came to the faith intellectually, or I should say came into the church through an intellectual conversion or a spiritual conversion, they can all agree on that one point, that, yeah, once I had my conversion and then looked into history, regardless of where that fell in their conversion, whether it was at the beginning or after their conversion, they can all agree to that. So I think the sentiment is true. But when you throw something out like that as your starting pitch, I mean, come on, guys. I mean, think about what the Orthodox, when they do that to us concerning the magisterium, right, and infallibility and so on and so forth, these points that divide us. What do? Well, we largely, our knee-jerk reaction is to dig our heels into the dirt and double down on what we're saying. So don't be throwing that out there, I'm pretty sure. Oh, I mean, yeah, obviously, Cardinal Newman said that after he was Catholic. Don't use that as a starting point to get someone to look at the church. You're just asking for their for their fallen human nature to step in the way and be like, no, heck you, buddy.
A dialogue that I hosted on this conversation, on this quote, but with Dr. Gavin Ortlund and Joe Heschmeyer, I think Dr. Ortlund brought up a really good point, that there's multiple ways you could take this. One is just kind of a description of reality. Like, there are no Protestants who are deep in church history, which to me just becomes this very
that's not true.
easily undermined claim, right? Like, there are certainly Protestants who know a lot about church history. And when people can't accept that as just like a description of reality, to me, it points to either a great ignorance or just willfully mischaracterizing people. Like, I'm not trying to paint with too broad of a brush here, but when you see like these hordes of Protestants that have PhDs in church history, that know a lot about church history, to simply say that it is impossible to know things about church history and not be Protestant just seems blatantly false.
Yeah, no, for sure. And Austin, I know for a fact you're never going to see this video, but if by some miracle you do, I got to say, I really appreciate your attempt to not fall into the same hole that you're criticizing people who use this argument for, and that is to say, making these broad statements and these blanket statements against people, right? And he's 100% right when he says that. When people throw that out there, there's so many ways to take that, and suggestions like, I'm sorry, guys, but and now I'm talking to the Catholics, but like, some of the best Bible commentaries come from Protestants, right? Some of the best historical analyses of what biblical history was like come from Protestants, right? So it's just patently false to say that Protestants are not historically literate, right? And that's not what Cardinal Newman was saying. That's not what he was saying at all.
Now, there's a second way you could take this, which would be that to be deep in church history means that you should not be Protestant, right? That there's some type of causal relationship that it pulls you in that direction, which is another thing that you could say. But again, we need to nuance that. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it also just doesn't always pan out. Unless you want to say that every Protestant who knows a lot about church history but hasn't left Protestantism is somehow doing so out of these malevolent intent or out of selfish reasons, like that seems really hard to then
and harsh
argue for. It seems like something that could be easily undermined, and it seems like just an unfortunate way to characterize so many people. And I hope that you don't feel I've done that in the way that I've characterized those who use this. I think for a lot of people who use this, it's kind of more of a rhetorical flourish. Just a nice quote. It's catchy, it sounds nice, it seems to pack a punch. Fine enough, but ultimately I think it hinders dialogue because it makes a grandiose claim that when push comes to shove just doesn't seem to be easily substantiated at this large level, whether you're talking descriptively or prescriptively. And for that reason, I would love if that argument was at the very least toned down in its frequency. Well, there you have it, folks. These are the 5 bad arguments for Catholicism. Of course, I'm sure there are more bad arguments. You could make any number of bad arguments about any number of things. And once again, to say that there are bad arguments for something doesn't mean that there aren't good arguments for it. In fact, I'll be following up this video with 5 bad arguments that Protestants use against Catholics. And I hope that in seeing that, you will realize that this isn't necessarily about who's right and who's wrong, but it's about coming to the table in good faith, having better dialogues, and moving forward the conversation between Protestants, Catholics, and ultimately to those who are looking on. Sometimes I worry about the state of these ecumenical dialogues, that if I weren't a Christian and I saw the way these Christians bickered with one another, I'd wonder what the point of all of it is. Like, if this is...
Yeah, and I'm going to stop it there and just give my final thoughts and close the video. This was a great video. I thoroughly enjoyed watching it and reacting to it. And I mean, he's right, largely. I mean, you know, and now I'm talking to the Catholics watching this. Like, guys, what he was just saying just then is 100% true, right? We have to conduct ourselves in a way that we have to assume that everyone who's watching us is someone who does not know our Lord, or who's had a bad experience with our Lord and actively rejects it, right? And that is to say that we need to treat every individual and meet them where they're, you know, with respect and care, and meet them where they are at, because ultimately the goal is conversion, right? It's not this halfway in between point. You know, we can get to that point and be happy that progress is being made, but we all know where the end goal has to be, right? And that is corporate unity with the mystical body of Christ. And so when we do that, or when we're evangelizing and serving as apologists for the faith, and we do it poorly, and we misrepresent the church, we're misrepresenting our Lord, and we're losing souls. We're not saving people, and we're not expressing the credibility of the church, of Holy Mother Church. Remember, our Lord prayed for the night before he died, right? He prayed that we might be one, so that the world might believe. And that's what this all has to be about. And yeah, you know, it's very interesting that all 5 of these arguments he presents can be spun in a way, I think, that can be good arguments, right? But it's just like he said at the end of every bad argument he presented, it has to be nuanced. These are not talking points. The faith is not a talking point, y'all. The faith is a deep, spiritual, emotional truth, cosmic truth, all right? So let's make sure that we're representing our Lord faithfully and truly. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you're not subscribed to Gospel Simplicity, you have to go do it. You have to go do it. I love Gospel Simplicity. Probably my favorite Protestant channel on YouTube. Certainly in the top 3. Certainly in the top 3. So even if you're not subscribed to me, go subscribe to Austin before you subscribe to me. And then come back and subscribe to me, because I want to get to 50 subscribers so I can live stream daily prayer. Alrighty, guys. You have a fine time, fine day, and I'll see you guys in the next video.